collective false memories lots of people seem to share. But we're not going down the usual paths, the alternate timelines or supernatural stuff. Instead, we're looking at a pretty rigorous scientific framework, one that suggests the Mandela effect isn't chaos. It's actually a predictable structural glitch in how we think.
It really is a profound way to look at it. It challenges how we think about memory, definitely, but maybe even reality itself. This deep dive today, it's all built around this idea of a fundamental conflict. It's the brain's, let's say, natural tendency towards unity versus the artificial constraints that language puts on things. And the sources we're looking at argue that this very dissonance, this clash, is what's actually causing these fractures in our collective reality.
Right. So our mission for you listening is to really dissect this idea, this linguistic neurological dissonance. We want to trace it all the way from, a tiny blip of confusion in the brain, like milliseconds we're talking, all the way up to a whole society kind of agreeing on something that isn't quite right. A shared fiction. We're basically exploring how the words we use, how we define our experiences, might actually be creating a rift that breaks our shared memory.
And the linchpin for this whole investigation, it turns out, is the relationship between two very specific feelings, temporal experiences, nostalgia and déjà vu. The core idea, the hypothesis we're unpacking, suggests that neurologically speaking, these aren't really two separate things. They're fundamentally the same phenomenon. And the glitch, the condition for it, gets created the moment we, as a culture, decide to label them as different. We draw a line where maybe there isn't one neurologically.
Okay, yeah, let's lay that core claim out clearly for everyone. So if the brain basically treats nostalgia and déjà vu as like two sides of the same coin, but then our language forces us to put them in completely separate boxes, that causes this dissonance, this friction. And then this dissonance gets solidified, maybe amplified, by collective agreement, what the sources are calling hyperstition. And that's what fractures our shared memory, leading to things like the whole Berenstain-Bears confusion. It's like we're literally defining reality into existence with our words, but sometimes those definitions just don't match up with how our brains are actually wired. So let's start where I think a lot of people start noticing something's up, with the definitions themselves. If you just, pull up Merriam-Webster or whatever and look up nostalgia and déjà vu, what jumps out is how much they overlap. Semantically speaking, they're not opposites at all. They're more like variations on this really singular theme. Both involve like temporal displacement, feeling out of time. Both have this recognition thing, this I've been here before or felt this before pattern. And both are pretty loaded emotionally, right? They hit you.
That intuition is spot on. And it's actually backed up quite powerfully by modern computational linguistics, too. When you run algorithms on the way we use these words, the semantic fields, the lexical networks, they keep coming back with the same core components, pastness, familiarity, some kind of temporal mismatch. But as you pointed out, there is a subtle difference in how we talk about them, and it seems crucial. It comes down to intentionality, or what linguists might call a modal operator difference.
Right. Déjà vu feels like it just happens. It's sudden, passive, maybe even a bit jarring. You don't try to have déjà vu, but nostalgia, that feels different. It often feels like something you seek out or cultivate. I always kind of thought of it like you're actively wanting that feeling of recognition. You're longing for that past pattern that feels good or familiar.
And that exact phrasing, that nostalgia, is basically wanting the feeling of déjà vu. That's precisely what these sources identify as the key distinction language grabs onto. So if we map it out, déjà vu is the passive bit, the recognition of pastness. It's the experiencing the past popping up in the present. Nostalgia, on the other hand, is the active part, the cultivation of that recognition. It's the state of wanting that experience, experiencing the past. The actual difference seems to be almost entirely in that intentional frame that our language or culture puts around it.
Okay, and this is where it starts to get, scandalous, as the outline puts it. Because this split, this linguistic division based on wanting versus having the feeling, it seems completely arbitrary from the brain's point of view. It's like our brain, the actual hardware doing the processing, doesn't really draw that sharp line. It seems to treat the underlying mechanism as fundamentally the same thing.
Precisely. And when you look at the hard neuroscience, we're talking high-resolution fMRI, event-related potential studies, ERPs. It's frankly undeniable. You see this really striking 70% overlap in the brain regions that light up when people report experiencing nostalgia versus déjà vu. They're sharing activity in really key systems. The hippocampus, obviously for memory, but also the ventral striatum, which handles reward processing, and self-reflection circuits in the medial prefrontal cortex.
Wow, okay, so it's not just like two neighboring memory areas overlapping a bit. It's the core machinery that connects memory to our sense of self and decides if that memory feels good or important.
Absolutely. And maybe even more tellingly, they show identical oscillatory signatures in these rhythmic electrical patterns in the brain, specifically theta waves around 4 to 8 hertz and gamma waves 30 to 100 hertz. These are patterns strongly associated with binding information together across time, pattern matching. All this evidence points towards them being basically different expressions, different outward symptoms, if you like, of a single unified neurological process. The sources are calling this the temporal recognition complex, or TRC. It's like the core engine for feeling that sense of temporal familiarity, that memory reward link.
Okay, if the TRC is unified, that brings us right back to that fascinating listener question. If nostalgia is just actively seeking that TRC state, could you actually use nostalgia to sort of trigger déjà vu on demand? Could you make yourself experience déjà vu just by deliberately thinking about the past in a certain way?
Well, the research suggests, yes, it seems empirically possible. There are recent studies using experimental protocols that confirm you can get controlled déjà vu induction by using nostalgic priming. Basically, by activating the wanting state, the nostalgia, you effectively lower the threshold needed to trigger the having state, the déjà vu.
That's wild. How did they measure that? How do you quantify triggering déjà vu?
So in these studies, they'd expose people to really personalized nostalgic triggers, things that would strongly evoke that feeling for them. Could be specific music from their childhood, photos with a lot of context, even smells linked to positive past memories. After this nostalgic priming, they'd do some kind of recognition task. The results were pretty dramatic. Participants who got the nostalgia prime hit a déjà vu induction rate of 73.4%. Compare that to the control groups who got neutral primes, their rate was way down at 11.2%.
Whoa, that's like a 7 times increase. So what's happening in the brain mechanically to make that happen?
Well, the nostalgic priming seems to trigger a measurable dopamine hit in those reward circuits, the ventral striatum again. That dopamine surge, which is basically the brain saying, ooh, past good, then leads to hippocampal priming. Essentially, the brain goes into this state of heightened readiness for pattern completion. It's like it's prepped and looking for familiar patterns. The sources call it a temporal recognition readiness state, or maybe a déjà vu susceptibility window. So by actively focusing on the past experience, which is nostalgia, you're literally tuning your brain to recognize a similar pattern now, which is the definition of déjà vu. The neuroscience really insists.
Right.
These are just two modes, fluid modes of one underlying system.
Okay, let's just pause there because the implication is huge. If the brain treats this whole temporal recognition thing as one unified system, the TRC, what actually happens when our language, our culture, with its neat little boxes, forces the brain to take that single experience and file it under two different mutually exclusive labels?
That's it. That's the friction point. That's where the glitch happens. This external pressure, this imposition of linguistic duality where there's neural unity, creates what we can actually measure as linguistic neurological dissonance. You have to remember, one of the brain's biggest jobs is the neural binding problem. How does it take all the simultaneous inputs, memory, emotion, sights, sounds, and weave them into one coherent, unified experience? That whole integration process gets fundamentally messed up when language comes along and artificially separates things that the underlying neural architecture knows belong together.
It sounds almost philosophical, like a category error.
Yeah.
But the sources are saying this isn't just abstract. It's a physical, measurable failure happening inside the brain structure.
Oh, absolutely. And it happens incredibly fast. Terrifyingly fast, really. It shows up within about 100 to 200 milliseconds. Right in the left frontotemporal language network. This is the brain's hub for really rapid categorization, for semantic processing. So the brain tries to slap a label on the experience. Is this nostalgia? Is it déjà vu? But the underlying TRC structure doesn't support that forced choice. And that categorization attempt basically fails almost instantly.
Okay, if it's failing that fast, how do researchers actually see that? How do they pinpoint the signature of that conflict?
They look for specific electrical markers that indicate processing difficulty, especially semantic difficulty. The main tool here is watching for something called the frontal N400 component in those ERP studies, the brainwave studies. The N400 is this negative going wave, usually peaking around 400 milliseconds after a stimulus. It's a classic sign that the brain encountered something semantically unexpected or difficult. Like if you read a sentence ending with a totally bizarre word, you get a big N400.
Ah, okay. So the brain experiences this unified TRC thing, but the language system demands a choice. pick one, A or B. And because that choice is artificial, it doesn't fit the actual experience, the N400 wave spikes. It signals semantic error.
Exactly. Seeing that N400 pop up specifically when people are forced to linguistically categorize these TRC states, that's strong evidence. It shows this linguistic interference immediately destabilizes things. It creates a real reconstruction conflict. The brain's trying to piece together this unified event, but language is yelling, no, it has to be one or the other. And that generates this specific negative signal right there in the frontal lobe.
And this isn't just a momentary blip, right? This high-speed conflict has knock-on effects. Effects on memory stability that sort of set the stage for the Mandela effect later.
Precisely. You go from that immediate failure state to a period of sustained vulnerability. There are studies on something called reconsolidation interference. These show that if you force someone to linguistically relabel a memory while it's being reactivated, say in a lab, you make them call a mixed temporal feeling purely nostalgia, even if it felt very déjà vu-like. Doing that opens up this specific window, about 24 to 72 hours long, a vulnerability window. And what's scary is, during that window, the memory becomes much more susceptible to external suggestions, to false intrusions creeping in. We're talking increases of 35% to 55%.
Wow. So the simple act of forcing the wrong label, or maybe just an incomplete label, onto a memory actively makes that memory trace unstable, porous even, easier to rewrite.
That's the core of linguistic neurological dissonance, yes. That forced reconciliation, trying to shoehorn a unified brain experience into two separate language boxes, generates the instability. It basically creates the perfect, repeatable, systematic precondition for false memories to form, the kind needed for something like the Mandela effect to take root. It suggests this isn't just random noise or individual error, it's a predictable structural consequence of language imposing its rigid rules on the brain's more fluid reality.
Okay, this feels like a really critical link then. We've got the individual glitch, the dissonance in one person's brain. But how does that scale up? How does that internal conflict become this massive, shared collective reality fracture like the Mandela effect? And the answer, you're saying, lies in this concept of hyperstition.
Right. Hyperstition is, well, it's a pretty radical idea. It suggests that our ideas, our linguistic constructs, the stories we tell ourselves collectively, they aren't just passive descriptions of reality. They can be active agents in reality. They can function causally, actually working to bring about their own reality. Fiction's literally becoming flesh, or at least function.
So the moment we as a society linguistically separated déjà vu and nostalgia, we created this conceptual fiction. These are two different things. And once enough people buy into that fiction, share it, invest in it, it starts acting like a real constraint, like a physical rule governing how our shared memory works.
That's the feedback loop, exactly. That initial linguistic separation, maybe just a subtle distinction at first, creates these artificial cognitive scaffolds across the whole population. Because language forces us to sort our experiences, these scaffolds start to systematically bias how everyone forms memories related to time and familiarity. Then, when you get mass discussion, people sharing experiences, arguing about definitions, especially amplified by social media, that collective energy, that investment, turns the initial linguistic error into something functionally real. It happens through these powerful positive feedback circuits.
Can you break down that positive feedback loop a bit more? How does just talking about something make a fiction real?
Well, think about the reinforcement. Someone misremembers something, maybe influenced by that initial dissonance. Say, I definitely remember it being the Berenstain Bears. Then dozens, maybe hundreds online chime in, yeah, me too, definitely Berenstain. Each confirmation reinforces the wrong category, the language-imposed one. It provides a little linguistic reward, a social agreement reward. And the sheer volume and speed of that consensus, it acts like a kind of collective measurement or confirmation bias. For individual brains, potentially already in that 24, 72-hour vulnerability window we talked about, this overwhelming external signal can basically overwrite the weaker, dissonant internal trace. The belief in the separation becomes self-fulfilling. The fiction gets baked in.
Okay, let's use the classic example then. The Berenstain thing. How does that fit this hyperstitional model?
It's almost the perfect case study, really. The confusion between Berenstain, which is the actual objective spelling of Berenstain, the incredibly common false memory, seems driven first by that high nostalgic loading. It's a childhood memory for many, saturated with exactly those kinds of fuzzy, unified, temporal recognition complex feelings that are vulnerable to the dissonance. But then the hyperstition kicks in because of very strong linguistic factors.
Right, the spelling itself. The Nussstein versus Dustein.
Exactly. Computational linguistics shows that the surname ending Ustein, Think Einstein, Frankenstein. It's a common Jewish and Germanic pattern, and it is 73 times more frequent in English usage than the ending us stain. So when someone's memory trace is already a bit unstable due to that underlying linguistic neurological dissonance, the brain, looking for the easiest fit, the most familiar pattern, defaults to the high-frequency, linguistically comfortable option. Berenstain.
Ah, okay. So the neural instability creates an opening. And then this powerful linguistic gravity, the sheer frequency of Schustein, pulls the collective memory towards the error, and then discussion locks it in.
And the data seems to bear this out pretty strongly. Quantitative analysis, looking at various documented Mandela effects, finds this striking 91.3% correlation. They correlate very highly with phenomena that score high on both nostalgic loading and potential for this kind of linguistic confusion or ambiguity. So the conclusion isn't just hand-wavy. It's suggesting the Mandela effect isn't random noise. It's a predictable systemic outcome. It's the structural consequence of our language imposing its rigid, maybe arbitrary order onto the brain's more fluid, unified reality. Our collective false memories are the tragic but measurable side effects of insisting on linguistic purity where the brain prefers unity.
Okay, that structural analysis is compelling, but it takes us to maybe the most out there part of this whole framework. How do we actually model this fracture spreading across millions of people? How does it propagate through the whole population? And this is where the sources apparently bring in quantum cognition, right? Scaling this glitch up to the mass mind level.
Yeah, this is where the models shift to handle collective ambiguity and uncertainty. The sources put forward this really radical idea that maybe these ambiguous collective memories, before consensus is reached, exist in a state of collective superposition. Like in this non-classical state, both possibilities, Berenstain and Berenstain, are somehow held as simultaneously true, or at least equally potential, states within the collective mind, the collective cognitive system.
Okay, I got to push on that a bit. Are we talking actual quantum mechanics governing memory and entanglement between brains? Or is this more of a useful mathematical metaphor for uncertainty?
It's more than just a metaphor, according to proponents of quantum cognition. This framework uses the mathematical tools of quantum theory, things like Hilbert spaces, specifically because classical probability sometimes fails to accurately model human decision-making, especially under uncertainty or conflict. The idea isn't necessarily physical entanglement between brains, but that the state of the collective memory itself, before being measured, isn't settled probabilistically like flipping a coin. It's genuinely indeterminate, like a quantum state. It's fuzzy until something forces it to pick a side.
Okay, so if the collective memory is in this fuzzy superposition state, holding both spellings at once, what acts as the trigger? What collapses the wave function, so to speak? What forces it to settle into one definite reality, even if that reality happens to be the wrong one, like Berenstain?
The argument is the collective discussion itself. The arguments, the blog posts, the social media threads, the sheer act of people talking about it and trying to reach an agreement. That process and the resulting linguistic consensus that emerges, even if it's wrong, acts as the measurement that forces the superposition to collapse into a definite state. Just like in physics, where observing a quantum system forces it into a classical state, the collective act of naming, categorizing, and agreeing on the memory collapses the fuzziness into a single, shared, though potentially false, reality.
So the language we use collectively and the social agreement we build around that language is the measuring device that resolves the uncertainty in our shared memory.
Precisely. And there's a field called quantum natural language processing. Linguistic categorization, mathematically, can function like this kind of measurement operator. When a whole population starts discussing the Berenstain Bears, using those separate categorized terms for nostalgia and déjà vu, forcing that underlying neural conflict out into the open and demanding a definite answer, which spelling is it? That collective linguistic act mathematically shatters the unified potential. It collapses the superposition down into one of the definite but contradictory classical options.
And the result we see, the observable phenomenon, is the reality distortion, the Mandela effect. This implies our shared reality, or at least our memory of it, is fundamentally shaped by how we collectively use language to pin down ambiguous internal states.
It does. And that's why the framework feels powerful to its proponents. This collective measurement process, collapsing the unified state into contradictory classical ones, generates the glitch we observe. And crucially, the sources suggest this quantum-like mechanism makes a huge, potentially testable prediction. It predicts we should be able to find Bell inequality violations in large-scale collective memory recall experiments.
Whoa, okay. Bell inequality violation. For listeners maybe not deep into quantum physics, what would that actually mean if we found it in memory studies?
Right. So Bell's theorem, classically sets mathematical limits on how strongly correlated two separate things can be if their outcomes are determined only by local factors in standard probability, like two separate coin flips. Finding a Bell violation in memory recall, meaning the correlation between, say, two different groups' memories about a specific Mandela effect item, is stronger than classical probability allows for, would be really weird. It would suggest the memory outcomes aren't just being determined by individual brains working independently or by simple classical influence spreading. It would hint at some kind of non-classical, maybe instantaneous, collective correlation. It would be evidence supporting this idea of a shared superposition state being collapsed by the collective measurement of discussion and categorization. The Mandela effect, in this view, becomes the literal artifact of the mass mind, forcing certainty onto ambiguity.
Okay, so we've traced the proposed cause. This tyranny of language over the brain's natural unity, amplified by social dynamics, maybe even with quantum-like effects. Which brings us to the big so what question, the one the listener raised. How do we fix it? How do we reform this fractured collective memory? How do we get back to a place where our nostalgia and déjà vu feel congruent again, where we all remember being in the same world, remembering the same things, like the actual Berenstain Bears?
Well, if the diagnosis is multi-layered, neural, linguistic, social hyperstitional, then the cure has to be too. Reforming the fracture means intervening at all those levels simultaneously. It requires, as the sources put it, a kind of re-engineering of the cultural logos, the underlying rational structure, the way we collectively define and know things.
Okay, let's break that down, starting with the language itself. The outline mentions linguistic parsimony. What's that mean, practically?
It basically means let's stop forcing the distinction where it doesn't neurologically exist. We need to formally recognize, maybe in psychology textbooks, in media reporting, even just in how we talk, that nostalgia and déjà vu are really expressions of that single temporal recognition complex. We need linguistic frameworks that treat them less like two totally different phenomena and more like maybe different certainty states or different intentional stances toward the same core experience. The key is killing the forced binary. It's not A or B. It's more like state A experienced with sudden high certainty, déjà vu, versus state A reflected upon with intention, nostalgia. We need to adjust the language categories to fit the brain's actual unity.
And we can potentially tweak that feeling of certainty directly, which leads to the neural fix, disrupting dissonance.
Exactly. We might be able to use neurotechnology to actually help individual brains resist getting forced into those artificial linguistic boxes. Things like real-time neurofeedback could potentially train people to recognize and maintain the feeling of the unified TRC state, reducing that neural binding conflict when language tries to split it.
Yeah.
And even more directly, research suggests transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, might play a role, targeting specific brain areas involved in decision-making and error monitoring, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Right, and there was specific data on that, a measured effect.
Yes. TMS applied to that region has been shown to measurably shift what shouldn't. This is basically a measure of how subjectively certain someone feels about a memory's time context. Targeted TMS could shift this coefficient by a factor measured as delta 20 1.08 PM.081. That might not sound huge, but it's significant. It suggests we could potentially physically tune down the brain's feeling of certainty just enough to make it less susceptible to jumping to a premature, language-driven categorization of an experience. It's like a physical intervention against the language problem.
Okay, so that helps the individual brain resist. But the Mandela effect is collective. We need to stop the hyperstitional engine, that social feedback loop that keeps the false memory alive and spreading. How do we do that?
This is where we need to leverage social dynamics itself, specifically using collective managed forgetting. We know the errors spread like a contagion. One study showed 64% of individual false memories could become shared by a group after just 3 rounds of discussion. That's fast. So we need to interrupt that collective measurement, that reinforcement cycle. And one documented way is through socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting, or SRF.
SRF, socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting. How does that work in practice to, say, erase the collective Berenstain memory?
It works by exploiting how memory retrieval functions. Basically, retrieving one memory can cause related competing memories to become less accessible. They get inhibited. So, with SRF, you'd get a group to focus intensely and repeatedly only on retrieving accurate details related to the true memory. For the bears, maybe everyone focuses intensely on remembering specific plot points from the books, the exact color of Mama Bear's dress, the sound of the cartoon voices, anything but the spelling. By deliberately, collectively avoiding any mention or retrieval of the controversial spelling, while constantly retrieving correct surrounding details, you can systematically induce the collective forgetting of the competing false detail, the Eston spelling.
Ah, okay. So you basically starve the false memory trace of attention and reinforcement while actively strengthening the correct one. You use collective focus to prune the collective memory garden, so to speak, weaponizing attention to break the feedback loop.
Yeah, exactly. You stop the collective measurement process from constantly collapsing the superposition into the wrong state. So the full solution isn't just about arguing which spelling is right. It's about fundamentally changing the collective cognitive machinery, the language, the neural processing, the social agreement process by which we define and agree upon these potentially ambiguous temporal experiences in the first place. Close the door on the dissonance itself. Hashtag check outro. So to wrap up, the evidence we've gone through today really points a compelling picture. The Mandela effect, seen through this lens, isn't some mystical anomaly. It seems to emerge quite logically from this really sophisticated structural interplay between our brain's unified binding systems, the rigid categories our languages often impose, and then the social consensus dynamics that act like a measurement, locking things in. Our shared reality, or at least our shared memory of it, seems dynamically shaped by the linguistic frameworks we choose to lay over the fundamental unity of how our brains actually process the world.
And I think what this framework really leaves us with ultimately is this call for a kind of intellectual sovereignty. We've laid out how the systematic fracturing of memory, these glitches like Berenstain, might be the inevitable result of the collective mind insisting on rigid, maybe fictional categories. The solution, then, seems to demand a conscious refusal, a refusal to let our cultural logos, our language habits impose an artificial duality where our internal neurological reality might actually be unified. We need to demand that congruence. So the final thought, the deep dive for you to take away from this is, if this failure of congruence in collective memory really stems from a kind of linguistic tyranny, from insisting that a single unified feeling must fit into two separate boxes, then where else might this be happening? What specific linguistic definitions in your own life, maybe around identity or emotion or morality, perhaps even political ideas, might be imposing an artificial, maybe even destructive duality onto something that, at its core, is actually a singular, unified reality? That's the exploration that really matters.